Sounds like a pregnant pause to me. Howdy. All right. It's a beautiful day in Texas. Anytime it rains, it's good. So it's a little chillier than we might like, but we're grateful that you're here. Texas A&M University is the best place in the world to be, and it's because of the people who make up the community called Aggie Land. And the Bush School is very proud to be a part of Aggie Land. In fact, I think we're the shiniest jewel in the crown of Texas A&M. But I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the Bush Presidential Library Foundation and its executive director and CEO, Fred McClure, who unfortunately could not be here tonight. I also want to welcome you on behalf of the Bush School with its dean, Ryan Crocker, who also could not be here tonight. Probably the greatest disappointment, because I know his disappointment is even greater than ours. President Bush couldn't be here tonight, but he sends his greetings. So President and Barbara Bush want you to know they're grateful for your attendance. They're very grateful for Secretary Franklin's participation here, and it's a wonderful, wonderful experience to be able to have her visit Texas A&M University, the Bush Library, the Bush School, and the Bush Presidential Center, where she's going to share with us some of her experiences. Secretary Franklin is a remarkable woman. She has accomplished so much, and she did it before women were expected to accomplish what they have done. Long before people talked about a glass ceiling, Barbara Franklin was breaking it. And not only did she break the glass ceiling, she created a climate so that women would have greater opportunities to serve in government. And more than anyone else, she probably gave opportunities to women to serve in high-ranking positions in our government. And you're going to learn a lot about that. But you should also know that she is a very accomplished leader, not just of opportunities for women to succeed, but for government to make a difference. She was the Secretary of Commerce to the first President Bush. In fact, we're approaching the anniversary of her getting sworn in as Secretary of Commerce. It was February 27th of 1992, and you ask why I would know that date, because February 24th of 1992 is when I got sworn in as the Secretary of Transportation. So Barbara Franklin and I were equally nervous at this time, 22 years ago, whatever it was, and wondering whether the Senate would confirm us. And we had been nominated about the same time to be members of President Bush's cabinet, and we served very closely together. During Secretary Franklin's tenure as Commerce Secretary, and remember, both she and I were only secretaries for a little less than a year. So we didn't have the opportunity to make the mistakes that other people made, but we had lots of opportunities to succeed. And Secretary Franklin had phenomenal success for our country. She was the first one to reopen the door to China. And she had a trade mission to China that took place at the end of President Bush's tenure, and it was remarkable in the opportunities that she created that we are realizing today. She helped open the business community to China, and she opened the Chinese mind to the American business community itself. She has gone on to serve on a number of corporate boards where she has been recognized as not only a leader for those individual companies, but she's a leader of all who participate in corporate boards. She's been in a governance position with the group that oversees, if you will, all corporate board membership in the country, and she's earned great recognition. She's been recognized by academic institutions, she's been recognized by business institutions, been recognized as a leader by governmental institutions, and she has been praised for not only her accomplishments, but she's been praised for how she has done her job and how she's created opportunities for others. She is a great friend, and she's a wonderful friend of the Bushes and a great friend of the Bush School and the Bush Museum, and we're grateful that she is here with her husband Wally, and they are a great love story, and I've witnessed that many times. And Wally has been very, very giving to his wife, and his wife has even been more giving to him. So it's been a great relationship to see. They're from New England. They don't park the car in Harvard Yard the way I do. but you'll notice Connecticut Yankee accents, but their experiences in Washington, D.C. and around the world really tell only a little bit of the story. You're going to hear a lot about the opportunities that she's created for others as she talks about her books. So, Secretary Barbara Hackman Franklin.
Thank you, Andy. That's wonderful. Howdy. I'm thrilled to be here, and Wally and I have just been having a wonderful time these last couple of days. Andy, thank you. That was more gracious than you needed to be, and I really appreciate it. And I hope everybody here knows about the great Andy Card. I assume you do. Because there's no one like you, Andy, who has served as first Deputy Chief of Staff for the first President Bush, Secretary of Transportation, and then Chief of Staff to the next President Bush, and in the Reagan White House. And he was a state legislator in his home state of Massachusetts, where all that funny accent comes from. we know. But he was the chief troubleshooter, too, for President Bush 41. I just remember when I was in office, and so were you, and we had a hurricane called Andrew that hit Florida pretty hard. And you were the one who coordinated all the relief that came from the government. And that was only one of the things you did. He is a unique and remarkable public servant. And I am proud to be sharing a platform with you and with Kathleen. You're great friends, and I love you both. So thank you for having me. Warren and I had a grand tour of the Library and Museum by Warren Finch. Is he here? So, we really liked that so much we came back. We came back today and just let it soak in. And one comes away, I mean, we've known the Bushes now for years, but you come away from that experience with an even enhanced understanding of the life of public service of both the president and that fabulous Barbara Bush. And the way his leadership really counted when he was president, well, he was in some other important places too, but particularly when he was president, and his actions really changed outcomes and changed what the world was looking like. Presidential leadership really counts. And of course, the quality of those, that couple as human beings is remarkable. And the Library and Museum picks up the life of service, but it also has such a warmth to it of family. I think it's a wonderful combination and a wonderful piece of history for our country. And then I had the opportunity to visit with Dr. Lori Taylor at the Bush School and the students, a group of students who we were so impressed and so committed to service, and it was just really thrilling to see this. There's such hope for our country, and we need it right now, but there's such hope. So what a great day and what a great university this is. So now let me turn to history of another sort. 40 years ago history. And you ask, what relevance does that have today? Well, hopefully it's relevant because of the lessons of history. And I was asked that actually by some students yesterday. Why should we care about what happened 40 years ago? Well, because there are lessons to be learned and hopefully inspiration to be gained from it. First lesson is presidential leadership really counts. We've already talked about our precious President Bush, but in this case that I'm going to talk about, it was President Nixon whose leadership really counted in terms of the advancing of women at that time. And the second thing is that there were some women who took on some responsible positions that women had never held before, and they succeeded, and they broke barriers, and those barriers have never been put back up. And the third lesson is that those women back then really supported one another. and they helped each other succeed. And I would hope that women today would learn from that too. So, our story begins in the 1970s. Who here remembers the 1970s? Oh, there are a few. Okay, I was afraid I was going to be the only one. You might remember what the world was like. And in this book by Lee Stout, who, by the way, was the head archivist at Penn State University, which is my undergrad alma mater, I'll talk a little about that in a few minutes. But it was a world, particularly domestically, in turmoil, even though we had the Vietnam War going on, and there was great consternation about that inside the country. The Civil Rights Movement, and of course the Civil Rights Act had passed in, excuse me, in 1964. And in 1963, when I was at Harvard Business School, the Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan came out. Do you remember that? Which catalyzed the women's movement. We all read it. There were so few women in my business school class. We all read that with great anxiousness. But that catalyzed the women's movement, and the women's movement was going on, but it was a left-leaning, some people said radical, kind of bra-burning movement for women's equality. And the world for women was very different. Now, Lee Stout does a great job of painting this picture in his first chapter here, but there was not in our country consensus about careers for women. If you were a teacher or a nurse or a secretary, okay, but women in other kinds of leadership roles, that was just not an expectation. And there weren't that many of them to begin with, in any field as you looked around. There was also not consensus in our country that careers and families could happen together. There's been so much change in attitude, but that was the way it was back then. Well, against this backdrop, which I've said is much better painted in chapter 1 of Lee's book, Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968. And our story begins, hopefully I can figure out how to do this. Okay, I'm technologically challenged on occasion. So our story begins with the question. At an early press conference in February of 1969, Vera Glasser, who was with the American Newspaper Alliance, very attractive, well-spoken woman, rose and asked this question. And I'm going to read it verbatim. Mr. President, in staffing your administration, you have so far made about 200 high-level cabinet and other policy position appointments, and of these, only 3 have gone to women. Can you tell us, sir, whether we can expect a more equitable recognition of women's abilities, or are we going to remain a lost sex? Can you imagine the gasp that must have gone through that briefing room? And it was mostly men. There's a photograph of it here in the book. She reported that the president seemed to not know quite what to do with that. So he said, well, gee, Vera, would you like to come into government? And then he got serious. And he said, very seriously, I had not known that only 3 had gone to women, and I shall see that we correct that imbalance very promptly. And then there was a circuitous chain of events that occurred after that in the White House. Now remember, at the time, the backdrop, there was not unanimity that anything about advancing women in appointments was a good idea. And that was true of the White House staff. I could name names, but I won't. There were people on each side. But one of the results of what the president said that day was a task force, a president's task force on women's rights and responsibilities. It was one of about 17 presidential task forces that were formed in that first year, having to do with key issues that the administration was going to deal with. And they were set up under the aegis of Arthur Burns. You remember Arthur Burns, who became chairman of the Federal Reserve, the same Arthur Burns who used to sit up there and testify before Congress smoking a pipe, and he'd sit there in a cloud of smoke, and they always wondered whether he was going to disappear. But anyway, Arthur Burns had working for him a man from Massachusetts by the name of Charlie Clapp. Maybe you knew Charlie, Andy. Charlie Clapp had the mission of staffing the task forces. And Charlie was a progressive thinker and decided that we really ought to have a progressive women and men on this task force, as opposed to the other kind who just wanted women to stay home and not advance. Charlie had a battle, as he was related it, inside the White House about who was going to be on this task force, and he won it. So it was populated with people who really wanted to move women ahead. The chair was Virginia Allan, a very good choice of a chair, a businesswoman from Michigan, who was one of these people who could just bring disparate thoughts and activities together, always with an objective in mind, and she was so fair-minded that you could just never argue with Virginia. She was wonderful. I came to know her well. Out of that task force, then, as a result, came a bunch of recommendations that were forward-looking. One of them actually was my job, the job that I held in that White House. Another one was what became Title IX. And there were various others. And that report came out in 1970. And nothing happened for a while. Again, because of the tugging and pulling inside the White House over what to do with these recommendations. Because as we said, there was not agreement. Until Robert Finch arrived. And you remember him, Andy, too. Bob Finch came from California, where he had been lieutenant governor with Ronald Reagan. He was an old friend of President Nixon's. He had run President Nixon's campaign in 1960, and he had gone to be secretary of what's now HHS. He came over to the White House as a counselor to the president, and in the middle of the year in 1970, and then things started to pick up. And he was the one who got the women's portfolio somehow. I still don't know whether it was given to him by the president or whether he just took it. The person who had it, who shall remain nameless and who just died within the last year, was just sitting on those recommendations that came out of the task force and didn't really want to do anything. By the way, the task force report was called A Matter of Simple Justice. And Lee Stout then picked that name up and put it on the book. Bob Finch believed that the cause of advancing women was right, but he also understood the politics. And there was a drumbeat coming from the left for the women's movement, but by then there were some Republican voices who were joining that chorus and were getting concerned that why aren't we doing more to help women advance? Bob Finch was able to marshal the decision-making apparatus, which you know well, in the White House, and there are copies of the memoranda that he got signed got the president to sign, so that something really was going to happen. And what happened was a three-pronged initiative. And this is really what made this whole era successful. And I have to say, I'll say it probably several times, it would not have happened at this time without presidential leadership. It simply would not have. There was too much toing and froing. The first prong was this, that the president requested of his cabinet secretaries and agency heads action plans about how they were going to advance women in their departments. He wanted them back in a month, and he wanted to know who was going to be in charge. Prong 2 was that I was hired to in turn recruit women at the senior levels of government build a talent bank of women, there was no such thing, and then monitor the progress that was made by these action, by the departments and agencies. Now, where do I come from in all of this? Well, I didn't have a plan to do this. I was sitting at a bank in New York. The bank is Citibank. It was First National City Bank then. And I got a call one day from a Harvard Business School classmate of mine by the name of Fred Malek. And Fred, by then, was heading presidential personnel in this White House. And he said, you know, the president wants to advance women, and we need somebody to come and create a function to recruit women and help this process along. Are you interested? Well, I didn't know if I was interested, but I thought the issue was right. I was dealing with some of the same kinds of things in my career. I mean, being told not to wear a red dress, for example, in the bank, that was not bankerish, and being told that, gee, you have a husband who worked and you don't need a raise. I thought, well, no, wait a minute, there's something that needs to be done here that maybe I could help. So I went to Washington. I was in New York and talked with the powers that be there and decided this was serious. And then decided, well, okay, I'm willing to do it. I was advised by any number of friends not to do it. They said, you know, you're taking a big risk. That administration will never do anything for women, and you're going to be part of a fruitless effort, and it's going to damage your career. Well, I decided to do it anyway because I thought the cause was right. And you know, when you're young, you think you can do anything. Isn't that true? And maybe we can. And so off I went to Washington, and there was no structure, and I landed with nobody to even answer the phones or the mail or whatever, but I was going to do this. About 2 weeks after I arrived, they decided I needed to be introduced to the press. And a press briefing was set up by one of the men in Herb Klein's shop, and it was in the Roosevelt Room in the White House, and only the women of the press were invited. Now, they walked in loaded for bear because they said, why? Why don't you have this in the briefing room like everything else? Why are you segregating us? Unhappy campers. And the first question to me out of the box was, how can you be the recruiter of women when your title is Staff Assistant for Executive Manpower? That is a good question with no good answer. And things just, I felt, went downhill. It was one of those experiences that we call character building. And we're glad when it's over. I learned from it, and actually the press that came out of it was not all that bad, but it said we were doing something, but it was really terribly uncomfortable for me, I can tell you. Anyway, that's prong 2. Let me get to the third prong of the 3. And that was that the president appointed Jane Baker Spain, woman from Ohio business, she was running a family business at the time, to come and watch over what was happening with women in the civil service. The jobs that I was to focus on were those that the president had some ability to control. So that's the 3-pronged effort. The action plans. I came into the White House to be the point person and to monitor the progress on those plans. And the president was paying attention, I can tell you, to the progress. And then Jane Spain came to civil service. The president set a goal for us. And this is also sort of basic businessy stuff here. Set a goal, okay? The goal was to double the numbers of women in that policy-making set of jobs in 1 year. And there were targets, there were numerical targets for the mid-level group and boards and commissions. I'm not sure we could today get away with setting numerical goals like this. I think someone would have, people would have complained, but we did it then, and it made a difference because there was something to mark yourself against. After 1 year, actually in 6 months, we had beat the first goal. And I have to say something here. A lot of people helped. I wasn't doing this all by myself. We never do things just on our own. But what I was doing to recruit, of course, I didn't know how to recruit. I'd not done this, but hopefully I could figure it out. I went to executive search people and said, could you help? We're looking for women to bring into government. The president wants to do this. Could you help us? And the uniform answer was, well, no, we don't have any women in our files because our clients don't ask for women. Well, okay, that's just the way things were. So what I did was to use the federal regions and go travel to each one, to a hub city, and find some people there who could help locate candidates that then we could bring back, build into a talent bank, and start to place. That's how it worked, but I must tell you, it was 24/7. I didn't care. I was going to do this, but a lot of people helped. And a lot of people also helped me to know where the jobs were coming up so that I could get there with candidates before they were automatically filled. Some people also helped me to know who the people were who didn't like what I was doing or that didn't think this whole effort was a very good one. So I really needed a lot of that kind of help. But it was one of these, I think when anyone is doing something that's sort of overwhelming, it's very energizing. And so, but a lot of people get into this, but that was really because the president wanted it done. So by April of 72, and that was more than, well, that was the year, the numbers in those top jobs had tripled from like 36 to 105. Now that sounds like not very many today, but back then it was rather a big deal. But the most important part of it was that most of those women were in jobs that women had never held before. And I'll get to who some of them were shortly. But the breakthroughs that were made, the barriers that were broken, and I have to say that all of those women were successful. Well, they were probably overqualified to begin with, but they were all successful. And that made a difference. That meant the barriers were never going to be put back up. And they were remarkable. They were a remarkable group. The mid-level positions, those 1,100, in that group, there were a number of non-traditional jobs, like narcotics agents and FBI agents and forest rangers and tugboat captains, that had never been held by women before either. And all of a sudden, some women got in some of those jobs. Now, were they really closed to women? Well, they really weren't, but nobody thought women could do them. Well, and we had women doing those jobs, and so that whole thing has changed. And of course, many more women on boards and commissions, and that's continued. I think the most important thing of all here is that the breakthroughs stuck. The barriers did not come back up, and as administrations progressed, bipartisan, there were more and more women in the point of office. Also, when bureaucracies in any organization get a hold of something and start doing it, it keeps happening. The Treasury Department at the time did a very good job. Now, who was the Secretary of the Treasury? John Connally from Texas. Who was the deputy at the time and the point person at Treasury for this whole effort? Charlie Walker, also from Texas. Got a lot of Texas, actually, in the results here. So, so it was a proud beginning, and this is the first photograph of women appointees ever taken in the Rose Garden. Now, this wasn't everybody, but it was all that we could round up for that day, and you might remember some of those people. I'll get to a few of them later. One of the things about that era was the hairstyles. Some of them were really quite unusual, and I include myself in that, and I don't know how I slept on all that hair, to be perfectly honest, but I did have it. And because of what happened here, and a president leading an effort, and it was visible, and it was serious, and the president, I should have said, he was monitoring progress. And when a cabinet secretary did a good job, cabinet secretary got a note saying, good for you. Cabinet Secretary missed a target and get another kind of note. And I know that because I was drafting those notes and sending them up the line, and all of that really counted. Anyway, the visibility of a presidential effort, I think, helped to make possible a whole lot of other things that occurred in this time frame. Now, there was the women's movement making noise, and then some in Congress got onto this, but I really think the president's leadership was the fundamental root of it. And some of the other things that happened here, the Equal Rights Amendment passed. There was a battle about that in the White House too, whether we should support it. The president did. He signed the bill. And that was one where there was nobody else there, and I was not over on the policy side of the shop, but I decided to weigh in because there wasn't anybody there. I ended up being the House woman because there wasn't anybody else to do that. And I was interacting with those who were setting policy over in the Ehrlichman side of the House and writing memoranda. And long story short, the president did sign as I said, the Equal Rights Amendment. Then there was the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, which passed in that same time frame, which gave more teeth to the old, it's not old, but it was just really revving up, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Title IX, you all know Title IX, and I think the ramifications of Title IX were far more than anybody ever envisioned at the time. And Anne Armstrong, another wonderful Texan, was named counselor to the president with cabinet rank in December of 1972. Now, Anne, there had not been a woman at a cabinet rank or in a cabinet secretary's position since the Eisenhower administration. Ovita Kolpabi, who was also from Texas. See what I mean about Texas contribution to this whole thing? But Anne came in there and was at cabinet rank. And then the first Women's Equality Day proclamation was drafted by was somebody in my shop. That had passed the Congress, that we had a Women's Equality Day, and every administration since has issued a proclamation. And the Roe v. Wade, I think, was something controversial as it is, came out of that same environment. And also the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Really important because prior to that time, if a woman wanted a bank loan or a credit card, you really had to have a man sign something for you. It's hard to believe it was like that, but it was. So this was another important act that came out of that whole environment. And I would go further and say that I really think that what President Nixon did, not that he was sitting there thinking he was going to do this, but what he in effect did was to take this left-leaning movement for women's equality and bring it right into the middle of American life, made it mainstream, made equality legitimate for women. And it's never changed since. Our society, I think, is remarkable in the way it can change, and there are now many more opportunities for women. And some of what what we did in government there, rippled through society at the time, because people would come to see some of us, me and others, and say, well, how do you do this? And some business people came and said, well, how do we advance women in business? So I think there was a ripple effect. But again, it goes right back to presidential leadership and the way that it really counts. I want to switch right now to something else, to tell you something about the women. And there's a really important group. And we have, in Lee's book, the second part of this book is the stories of the women. The first part is telling how the president did what he did and why it worked. Really, it worked because it was a managerial effort. And the president led it, and he looked at progress, and that's how things get done in this world anyway. But after I left Commerce, I didn't have presidential papers, I had Commerce, I had governmental papers, went to Penn State, my alma mater, which is where they have a wonderful archival system. The head archivist was Lee Stout. And he went through these White House papers, which were a mess. They'd been in boxes for 20 years. And he called me one day and he said, you know, this was really important. This wasn't just a PR thing. This was important. Have you thought of trying to bring this chapter back? Well, no. Have you thought of an oral history project? Well, no. I didn't know anything about oral history. I know a lot about it now, and I'm a believer in capturing the stories of those who make history, and it just adds color to what the events are. And I know that archivists know this too. Anyway, on a wing and a prayer in 1996, we started an oral history project in my DC office with Penn State Archives being the partner. That history project is called A Few Good Women. And that's why the A Few Good Women is in the title. We started with one of my lists of women appointees from my papers. And we had to find the women to interview. And Lee's kind of droll. I'm sorry he's not here. He said, you know, you better start with the oldest ones. Which was good advice. We knew where some of them were, but we didn't know where all of them were. So we had to go beating the bushes and try to find them. And we found as many as we could. Lee trained, we hired someone to do the interviewing, and she was wonderful. Lee trained her. And this collection today has about 50 oral histories in it, and it's housed at the Penn State Archives. You can access it online, and if you really are serious about this, you can listen to some of the histories. And Susanna Mouse is here, who was in my company at the time and actually worked on some of this as we were putting this project together. It was quite an interesting whole thing to relive some of what went on back then. But the really fascinating part of it was the material that was gathered from these women. And the second half, as I said, of Lee's book highlights the women. So let's start with Anne Armstrong. You know well, and she was a regent here. Anne was co-chair of the Republican National Committee when I came to the White House. Was very supportive and was perfectly wonderful. I thought she was the best politician in the universe. I really did. And a perfectly gracious, charming person who, when I then was leaving, she came when she was counselor and set up an Office of Women's Programs. By then I was moving on to be a commissioner at the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And as we know, Anne went on to be ambassador to the Court of St. James, and just to be a perfectly, I think, wonderful role model. I've got to tell you, though, a sidelight here. After we had these results coming out in '72, the appointments of women was going very well. We had a campaign revving up over here. Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP for short. Dreadful name for any campaign, I think. But I began to watch, I'm sitting in the White House, watch what they were doing as they were slotting speakers and whatever into the convention. And there were no women. And I had this terrible, I just remember it, I had a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I thought, oh no, after what we've done over here, how could they be missing it over there? And so some of the men I had been working with in presidential personnel were now at the campaign, so I started writing memos and calling and whatever. And the net of it was that they picked it up and they began to slot women into various places, and Anne became the first woman to keynote a convention of either party. And Anne was a great pioneer. Helen Delich Bentley. This is a piece of work, and I really must tell you about Helen. When I got there, she was chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, and the way she got that job early in the administration is detailed in the book, and it's quite a story. You'll get a sense for Helen. She's very proud of her Serbian ancestry. Helen made her career as a journalist covering the port of Baltimore. And she picked up some salty language in the course of that, and she still uses it today, I can tell you. That is right after her swearing in, and you see how demure she looks with this little pillbox hat. Demure is something Helen Bentley is definitely not. And she was one who was also pounding the table early in the administration about the advancement of women, and she was also in league with Bob Finch when he came to the White House. Helen was a great promoter of women. She went on to be Congresswoman from Maryland for a decade, and she is still working today. She is 90. Wally and I went to her 90th birthday party in November in Baltimore, and I think the whole Maryland political establishment, mostly Democrats, were there. She gets great accolades for having the port of Baltimore dredged, and she's really something else. I can't begin to tell you. The port of Baltimore is named for her today. When I got to the White House and had no secretary, Helen sent me a dictating machine, which was probably as big as this table, and said, okay, dictate and send it to my office, and we'll turn it out for you, and then you can sign it. And that's what I did. And Helen was enormously helpful. I'm very fond of her. Julie Nixon Eisenhower, we have an oral history from her. And her history talks about the role of Pat Nixon in all of this. We're often asked, why did President Nixon do this to advance women? Well, I don't really know, but I can guess. If you know anything about Pat Nixon, she was a self-made woman. Got herself educated, humble background, got herself educated, got herself to New York, was a teacher. And she, I do think, had an influence on her husband here. And he had 2 daughters. I think all of that worked into the mix, and he was politically sensitive, but I think there was something else going on. Julie relates how upset, or disappointed is a better word, her mother was when her husband did not appoint a woman to the Supreme Court when there were 2 vacancies in 1971. The whole Supreme Court thing is another episode that I could tell you about. We were madly trying to find women, and there weren't any who were philosophically compatible. But Pat Nixon spoke out about that, apparently at the dinner table and publicly. The military. It was during this time that the first women general officers were made of that rank at the Department of Defense. And here are some of the first ones. The one on the far right is Major General Jean Holm, Air Force, the first woman to achieve that rank. The others are Army, and there were some admirals as well. They were a remarkable group, and Jean Holm did an awful lot to clear away some of the old regulations that held women back in the military. Mel Willard was the Secretary of Defense. He was congressman from Wisconsin, and he was the one who really made that happen. He is still alive, and we hear from him occasionally. Great man. Romana Banuelos was the first Hispanic treasurer of the United States. And this is a fascinating story. She was born in Arizona to a poor Mexican-American family. And then they were all deported back to Mexico during the Depression. I didn't know we did that, but I guess we did. And then 10 years later, she came back to California. By then, she had 2 young children, had no money, and didn't speak much English. And she got herself a job as a dishwasher and made tortillas at night. She learned to make tortillas from her mother. Scraped up enough money to get the machinery to make more tortillas, and then started selling them. But then she had another husband by the name of Alejandro to local businesses. And all of a sudden, she had a business. It's still there. It's called Ramona Foods. And then she helped to found a bank that was going to help Latinos who needed credit, Pan American Bank in East Los Angeles. And she was doing all of this, had done it, and then became Treasurer of the United States. She wasn't terribly comfortable. She was an entrepreneurial person in the bureaucracy, but she did it. And her children and grandkids are running this business today. This is a real American dream story. Catherine May Bedell Now, Catherine Bedell was a congresswoman, she was Catherine May, from the state of Washington, Republican, and she's pictured there along with the two Nixon daughters and a couple of other people that Mary Brooks to the left, who was then treasurer of the United States. Catherine's oral history has in it some wonderful stuff about the Civil Rights Act. She was in Congress then, of 1964, and how she and it was a bipartisan group, small group of congresswomen, went to see the chairman of the Rules Committee in the House. And they went to see him to get him to put sex into the Civil Rights Act. Well, he was a charming Virginian who said he'd be pleased to do that, ladies, he said. And he then did. Now, he was against the Civil Rights Act, and he thought that putting sex in it would really sink it. Well, we know what happened. It passed, and the rest is history, and Catherine's story about this is marvelous. Anyway, she lost her seat in 1970 and came in to be chairman of the Maritime Commission, which is now the International Trade Commission. Remarkable individual. Dixie Lee Ray. I recruited Dixie Lee Ray from the state of Washington to the Old Atomic Energy Commission. She was a scientist, a PhD, I think she was a biologist, but was well known in Washington, but knew how to talk science in layman's language. And she thought we were not serious about appointing women. I had to convince her. Anyway, she was appointed, came to Washington, a real gold-plated character. She lived in a mobile home. She wore blazers and knee socks and had two large dogs who went with her everywhere, including to the office. And then when Jim Schlesinger was the chairman of that commission, and he was moving over to the CIA, and we had the brilliant thought, well, maybe Dixie Lee Ray should become the chairman. Jim was terribly against this and had a name for her that I will not repeat. I've seen him recently, and we talked about this again. Anyway, we just waited till he left. And then we elevated, the president elevated her to be the chairman. And then she subsequently left, became a Democrat, and ran for governor in the state of Washington. And that's what that poster is from, a real character. Connie Newman, I recruited to the Consumer Product Safety Commission before I knew I was going to be a member of it. And Connie subsequently did a bunch of other things in government as well, and did a lot of work through the State Department in Africa. And this is a photograph. This is hard to read. It's Cynthia and John Hall. Now, Cynthia, I recruited to the Tax Court of the United States. Never been a woman there. She was a tax attorney in Los Angeles, as was her husband. They were in different firms. And I remember calling her and saying, would you be interested in this seat on this court? And she said, well, this is totally impossible. My husband and I are both in different law firms, and between us, we have 6 kids. I can't possibly come to Washington. Well, it turned out that one of the men in presidential personnel knew that there was somebody in the Treasury Department who'd gone to law school with John Hall. And so that person was then sent to Los Angeles to tell John Hall he really needed to come back to Washington and be the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy. And that way, then Cynthia could come too and sit on the tax court. And that's how we got them both. And they took a fair amount of criticism. We think it's the first time there was a husband and wife both working for the federal government. Now it's fairly commonplace, but I think this was the first time. And they were criticized. I mean, how can the two of you be taking money from our government? She went on to be a district court judge, and then sat for years on the Ninth Circuit in California, a very distinguished jurist. She just died a few years ago. I was enormously fond of Cynthia. Virginia Maurer was the president's consumer advisor, and this was when consumerism, was kind of getting into our society as being a real thing. Now it's not talked about; it's just kind of there. She had come from Pennsylvania. Was very helpful also to me when I arrived, and she only died very recently too, at age 96. And then there was a sequence of several others who served in this administration who went on to serve President Bush. The first one being Elizabeth Hanford then, who was a deputy to Virginia Nauer in the White House Consumer Affairs Office. She married Bob Dole later, and then went on to be a cabinet secretary in the Reagan years, and then a labor secretary for President Bush 41. Carla Hills, same thing, came to the Department of Justice as an assistant attorney general. I think it was antitrust toward the end of the Nixon years. And then she, too, went on to be secretary of HUD in the Ford administration, and then trade representative for Bush 41. And that's me. And the greatest honor of my life has been serving in this man's administration. My respect, admiration, love for both Bushes is unlimited. That is Sandra O'Connor. That's Justice O'Connor over there on the left. And that's Wally. That's my husband, standing right there with me. Susan B. Anthony was not an appointee. She was a friend that I had, and she worked for me, actually. Several women's groups wanted to give a bust of Susan B. Anthony to the White House as a great symbol. There is a bust of her in the Capitol. It's marble, and she's much more severe. They did her in bronze, and she's a very severe-looking character. Well, between the time we could arrange a presentation, it turned out to Mrs. Nixon, she resided in the closet of my office in the third floor of the old executive office building. And in the dead of night, on occasion, she would steal out of that office, and she would land in the office of someone who'd said or done something detrimental to women. And then I had to pick her up in the morning. She was pretty heavy. Bring her back and put her back in the closet. And finally, we had her presented, and she stood for 15 years on a pedestal at the entrance of the East Wing, which is the First Lady's side of the White House. And then we launched. This book was written, the reason this is in here so you can see what Lee Stout looks like. That's the author there on the left. This book was launched at the National Archives for Women's History Month as a celebration. And there was a panel that included Lee, myself, Helen, Bentley. That's Helen, and that's Judy Woodruff, who was the moderator. And that fabulous Barbara Bush has done a blurb, which is on the back of the book. I don't know, can you read that? Or should I read it? I love it. I really appreciate that she did this. When I see the words untold story, my interest is always piqued, since they often contain wonderful surprises. A matter of simple justice is just such a story. About the women who worked in the Nixon administration, became part of the women's movement, and I am thrilled that Barbara Franklin, along with President Nixon, is finally getting the credit she deserves for advancing the cause of women in the workplace. That's really, really nice. And I'm very, 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 very grateful to her. Hopefully, there are some inspirations and lessons of history that come out of what happened so long ago that broke some barriers. That presidential leadership, any leadership, but presidential leadership, in this case, President Nixon, really counts. But leadership, wherever it's found, really counts. And when some pioneering people step forward and do things and break barriers, and that they stayed broken, that's important. It paves the way for those who can follow. And these women back then really supported each other. And I would hope that that would happen today, and that we would all be encouraging and supporting women, young and old, to dream bigger and aim higher. And thank you. Thank you for having me here. I loved it. Sure. Do we have, yeah, I talk too much. We use too much time.
Does anyone have any questions of Secretary Franklin?
Or comments, even.
Well, yes.
You listed Roe v. Wade is one of the major advances in the 70s.
That could be debated probably, but yes.
And now, 40 years later, you know, it's still a very divisive issue. So.
Yeah, my point was that I think that Roe v. Wade came out of that general atmosphere of that time. That was the point. I think it can be debated whether it was an advance or not, and it's still a contentious issue. In fact, I think it's more so now than it was back then. And I mean, we just need to have the debates about it. But that was my intent, not that it was necessarily to be agreed or not to be agreed with, but that it came out of the environment of equality for women.
Do you think that we are actually having this honest debate now?
I guess it depends where you are. I think you're having some of it here, aren't you? At least I read that. I think some of that goes on state by state. I don't know. I think it's a highly personal issue, myself. I would prefer it not be in the public domain, myself. That's my view.
Yes.
Secretary Franklin, just thank you for being here, first of all. You really enriched the programs. Attendance at Texas A&M is really enriched by people like you being here, so I'll just say that first. My question is, what advice you might have to women in particular who are going out into our careers, finishing graduate school, whether it be politically or in business, just words of advice, things you like to empower us with maybe?
Well, I think you should find something to do that you love to do, and do it well. You know, that's what my father always said. You can do anything you want, but do it well. So I would say that to you. Remember that leadership counts, and consider wherever you go that you have opportunities to be a leader and that you should be a leader, and that integrity counts. President Bush would probably say that if he were here. Integrity counts, character counts, your reputation is what you are, what you have that goes with you, and so you want to do things that demonstrate that integrity counts and always will, that your ethics are of the highest variety. So that's what I would say. And then you just go for it and have fun with whatever it is you're doing.
Yes.
I would personally like to think I graduated from high school in 1975. What you and all these women did benefited me when I went to college and I got out of college. Now it makes sense because I never understood how all this had unfolded. I've never met anybody who actually personally ended up helping me with respect in the country. And I was a follower of the women's movement, but I can't tell you how grateful I am for what you and all these others did for people like me. I worked actually under Sissy Moore in Austin, over at Forestry for a while, and it was amazing the things they would talk about, how progress was being made. And now I understand how it happened. And I want to thank you very much. You actually personally affected my life.
Well, a lot of people help. But thank you for that.
All right, well, thank you very, any question? Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was in high school in the 50s, so that's my generation.
So was I.
I have an issue with something that you said at the beginning, and I think you kind of ended up here too. That is that you were saying that you were encouraging other women to help other women. And in the first part of your first chapter of the book, it talks about the fact that there are more women graduating from college. I think there are also more women graduating with graduate degrees from college. And so we see major advances going on. I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We hire students from A&M, and we pick the best. 70% of those, I'm guessing, are women. They're the best. What I see as a man is that the guys are being, and I don't, at some point, it may not be now, it may be 20 years, 50 years from now, but at some point, I think it's important to say we need to help everybody. And we all, I mean, if you're a woman, you need to be helping the guys as much as the girls.
And I don't disagree with you. And this is what equality is really all about, isn't it? That we don't have to make these distinctions of helping women, helping men, that we're all helping each other. That's where we'd like to be. I don't think we're quite there, but that's where we'd like to be, and so I appreciate your comment. I think we're making progress, and I think the American society, in a way, to me, is amazing in the way we do make changes as we need to, and it's a remarkable country we're in. But striving for true equality, I think, is worth striving continually.
Professor Valerie Hudson has a question.
I'm grateful to meet you as well. This is an untold story for me also. I was interested in your views on what's left to do. As you know, these kinds of issues are still with us. And we have books like Amen,
Right.
Andrew Slaughter's article, and so I guess I'm interested in your views of where we should go from here. I'm also interested in the untold story of how balanced family here. I think that is a story that nobody knows. So all these wonderful women whose faces we saw in your PowerPoint, how did they do it?
Well, I think you'd almost have to ask each one of them how they did it, because the stories would be different. And I do think one thing that's changed is that our society now thinks having families and careers is okay. Now, maybe you don't do everything all at once at the same velocity, but that the combination is okay. It really wasn't so okay then. So some of these women would have been never married, but actually a lot of the ones that I showed you were married and had children. And so how they did it, I wish they were here and you could ask that question. I think this is kind of the age-old question that we're still asking, how to best do this so that everyone, family, career, husband, however you do this, so that it all works out the right way for all concerned. One of the things that gets said, and this was, I've been in a session with talking about Lean In, the book, and somebody said, well, now wait a minute, leaning in isn't maybe what everybody wants to do. Maybe all women don't want to lean in. Well, the truth is that what we were struggling about, what we were for in terms of equality, was for women to have choices about what they wanted to do. Not be stereotyped one way or another, but to have the choices. So if it turns out that there's some women who don't want to lean in, or don't want to lean in right now, and they maybe want to lean in 5 years from now, that there ought to be the opportunity. Same for men. I mean, the same thing really ought to be true. The problem today, in part, is that some of our organizations are not set up this way. Now, I'm seeing more of it in the business sphere, where there are more flexible kinds of arrangements, work arrangements for both men and women. Aetna, which happens to be a corporate board I'm on, has a large, thousands of employees who are working at home. And it's set up to work. They are set up to work at home, and it's perfectly acceptable, and it doesn't mean that next year they're going to have to come to headquarters. It's just a different way to get productivity and to satisfy home-type needs. So there's some other things that really need to be thought through in terms of how organizations work to make our equality user-friendly for everybody, those with families or those who don't. But I think it's just one of those questions that every one of us, male or female, has to figure out for ourselves how we're going to balance all we want to do. And we don't have to do everything, as I said, at the same decibel level all the time. There may be different chapters. But I'm not to say that all this is easy. It's not. But I think it's highly personal. I don't think there's a silver bullet, in other words.
Yes.
I don't think so. I wish there were.
Last question.
I wanted to ask, since you got so many women in politics and government, how someone can get younger people to do that, because I'm a freshman, and a lot of the people I know, they don't care about what's going on in politics, and they think that the government doesn't care about it, so they say they don't want to participate. And they don't even participate in, like, school, like at our university, in our university's politics, like no one's usually voting for like Senate and student body president. So I wanted to ask you, how could someone like me get more younger people involved? So we can be represented too.
Well, I see some other students here. I don't know what the answer to that is. Can you form some kind of a group where you talk about what's going on in the world or what's going on here on campus? I don't know. I'm not the best one to ask. I would say get involved in politics. Wouldn't you say, Andy?
Absolutely.
Get involved in...
You cannot have a democracy without people who participate in the political process. And
well said. And I feel that we all have to do that from whatever chairs we're sitting in, that we all need to participate in some way in the political process. So do we have a Republican group here on campus? Do we have a Democratic group here on campus?
We do.
Maybe we have others? I don't know. But maybe you get involved or form your own little group and attach yourself to some political group. That work? Yeah. Maybe you need some recruits. You need to do some recruiting. It's worth doing. And I would say, I mean, Andy's done a lot of this too. So has my husband, actually. I've been involved in politics of some kind or another, really, as an avocation through my whole life. And it's been energizing, but very enriching and satisfying. And knowing that I could play some role in what happens. And I think if we don't do that, then we can't criticize what happens if we're not trying to make a contribution to it. And I've met people that I would never have encountered that have enriched my life through the whole process. So I would say get involved in politics.
thank you. Now, I want to bring this to a close. And Barbara Franklin, you have been very humble in your talk. You don't know that she was the one who cracked the barrier of women going to the Harvard Business School. She was in the very first class that admitted 18 women when there were well over 300 men, 600 men at the Harvard Business School, and earns great accolades for not only her performance as a student there, but her performance after she left being a student there, and has been a champion in industry and for our country and a noble public servant. And she is one of the few good women. The Bush School is fortunate that Constance Newman, who you saw highlighted, is also very involved with the Bush School here at Texas A&M University. She's been serving on the Bush School Advisory Board since its inception and has been very, very active at the Bush School. So we have two women who are more than just a few good women helping with the Bush School. I thank the people who are viewing this online and streaming to watch the Bush School, the Bush Library Foundation, and Texas A&M offer this presentation. And Secretary Barbara Hackman Franklin, thank you very much, and thank you for generating so many great memories. Thank you, and remember... Texas A&M is the home of excellence, leadership, loyalty, respect, selfless service, and integrity, and you're all invited to be part of every one of those words. President Bush has lived them. Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Andy.